A cold wind drifted across the silent valley as the cowboy pushed through the thick pines, following the echo of a desperate cry that refused to fade. When he found the giant Apache girl trapped in a brutal bear trap, her trembling breaths shook the ground like distant thunder. Fear and pain filled her eyes, yet she tried to look brave. He knew helping her could bring trouble from her tribe, but leaving her meant watching her die alone. With shaking hands, he freed her, lifted her heavy weight, and carried her through the dark woods while every cracking branch made him think an ambush was coming. All night he guarded her, never knowing that his kindness was changing both their destinies. But at sunrise, the earth rumbled under hundreds of hooves, and the Apache Chief arrived with warriors, staring at the cowboy with a demand that would turn his entire world upside down. The Old West stretched endlessly under a burning sky, a land where dust storms rose without warning and silence felt heavier than iron. The cowboy lived a quiet life on the edge of this wild frontier, waking before dawn, tending his horses, and speaking only to the wind because no one else lived within miles of his small cabin. He liked it that way, far from trouble and far from the dangers that roamed the plains. But even a peaceful life can crack in a single moment. One evening, while checking his traps near the shadow of the tall cliffs, he sensed something wrong. In the air, a strange uneasiness that made his horse snort and stomp. The forest seemed to whisper warnings he could not understand. He followed instinct, stepped deeper into the trees, and unknowingly walked toward the encounter that would shatter his routine and pull him into a world he never imagined. Moving deeper into the whispering trees, the cowboy felt the air grow tense, as if the forest itself tried to warn him of something waiting beyond the next bend. But he pushed forward, guided by the uneasy instinct that had already pulled him away from his quiet evening and into the shadows beneath the cliffs. As he stepped over a fallen log, he noticed fresh marks on the ground. Large branches snapped clean, rocks shifted, and heavy footprints pressed deep into the dirt as though something massive had stumbled through in pain. His heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the sharp sense that someone out there needed help. And when a faint cry reached him again, rough and trembling, he followed it without hesitation. The trail grew clearer with each step, scattering pine needles, torn brush, and long drag marks that told the story of struggle, until he rounded a cluster of trees and froze, breath catching in his throat. There, half collapsed against a boulder, was a giant Apache girl, her height towering even while she sat, her leg clamped cruelly inside a steel bear trap that glinted cold in the fading light. She tried to look fierce, tried to hold herself tall, but her body trembled, and her eyes were wide with fear and pain, shining like dark storms ready to break. For a moment he could only stare, stunned by her size and the raw strength she clearly possessed. Yet all he saw beneath the shock was a wounded soul fighting to stay conscious. She flinched when he stepped closer, lifting her hands as if expecting harm, and he quickly raised his own to show he meant no danger, speaking softly so she would hear calm instead of threat. Her breaths were sharp, each one pushing through clenched teeth, and he could tell she had been trapped for hours, maybe longer, the metal tearing into her skin every time she tried to move. He knelt beside her carefully, feeling her watch him with guarded eyes as he examined the cruel jaws of the trap, and he understood that freeing her would take strength, patience, and absolute trust, something she had no reason to give a stranger. Still, he whispered reassurance and worked his hands beneath the rusted bars, pushing with everything he had while she bit down on the edge of her sleeve to keep from crying out. The trap resisted at first, unmoved by his effort, but he refused to stop, muscles burning as he forced the steel apart inch by inch, until the pressure finally snapped free and her leg slipped out, bruised and bleeding, yet no longer crushed. She gasped and leaned back against the rock, eyes softening with a mix of shock and relief as she realized he had chosen to save her despite knowing the risks tied to her tribe. He wrapped her leg with his scarf, lifting it gently to ease the pain, and in that fragile moment, he understood that whatever storm waited ahead, this single choice had already tied their fates together in ways neither of them could escape. Asterisk. Girl tried to steady her breathing as the cowboy tightened the scarf around her wounded leg, and before he could say anything, a low growl rolled through the trees, making both of them lift their heads toward the darkening woods where yellow, eyes flickered like tiny embers, waiting to ignite. He knew the fragile balance between ranchers and the Apache could shatter if he was caught with the chief's daughter. Yet leaving her in the open meant letting danger swallow her without mercy. He slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her carefully so her injury would not worsen. And though she stiffened in fear, she did not resist, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes as if she could not understand why a stranger risked so much for her. The sky deepened into a heavy blue as night swept over the valley, and the scent of pine mixed with the cold air while distant howls rose again. Closer this time, echoing from the ridge and reminding him that predators were already tracking the scent of her blood. He moved quickly through the forest, adjusting his steps to keep her balanced, and she clutched his shirt lightly, not out of trust, but because pain made her vision blur and she feared slipping from his arms. She studied his face in the faint starlight, noticing how focused he looked, how he kept glancing over his shoulder before tightening his grip and moving faster whenever branches snapped behind them. He had always lived alone, far from trouble, but now every sound felt like a warning and every shadow looked alive, pushing him to protect the girl even though he barely knew her name. Her breathing grew uneven, yet she stayed silent, sensing he needed concentration more than conversation. And when her fingers trembled against his shoulder, he whispered gently that he would not let anything happen to her. That simple promise made her blink in surprise because no rancher had ever spoken to her with such calm sincerity. And though she tried to hide it, gratitude softened her tense expression. The forest path twisted downhill toward an old hunting cabin he had not used in years, its roof barely visible through the trees. But it was the only place close enough to shield her from the cold and the creatures following their trail. As neared the clearing, another howl cut through the darkness, sharper and closer, urging him to push forward with renewed determination while her heartbeat pressed faintly against his chest. When he finally reached the cabin, he kicked the worn door open with his heel, carried her inside, and set her gently on a pile of old blankets as the wolves continued pacing beyond the tree line. In the dim glow of the cabin's single lantern, she gazed at him with a mix of fear and wonder, unable to understand why a man with every reason to walk away had chosen instead to carry her into safety, when the night itself seemed ready to swallow them both. The girl watched him move around the dim cabin with careful steps, her breathing steadying as he gathered whatever supplies were still usable. And when he knelt beside her again, the warmth of the small fire he had started pushed away the cold that had settled into her bones. He cleaned her wound with slow, steady hands, dipping a torn cloth into a pot of warm water before pressing it gently against her injured leg. And even though the pain made her jaw tighten, she stayed still, sensing he was doing everything could to ease her suffering. Outside, the wolves paced through the brush, their low growls weaving through the night like distant thunder. But he kept feeding the fire, building it tall enough to warn predators away while allowing its light to fill the cabin with a soft, protective glow. When he handed her a cup of water, she hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should accept anything from him, then took it with a quiet nod, her fingers brushing his in a fleeting moment that carried more uncertainty than either of them knew how to name. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with questions neither had dared to ask. And as she leaned back against the wooden wall, she studied his face with an intensity that made him pause. For the first time since he had found her in the forest, she spoke, her voice low and rough from hours of pain, telling him her name and explaining that she had been sent alone into the wilderness to prove her readiness for adulthood, a tradition in her tribe that demanded courage and strength. Her gaze flickered toward the fire as she admitted she had refused help earlier in the day because she wanted to complete her challenge without assistance. But the bear trap had turned her test into a nightmare she had not expected. When she whispered that she was the daughter of her tribe's chief, the air in the cabin seemed to tighten, and the cowboy felt a weight settle over him as he realized the danger he faced if her people discovered them together. She watched his reaction closely, expecting fear or retreat, yet he simply nodded and said her title did not change the fact that she was hurt and deserved safety. A response that made her blink, as though she had not heard kindness spoken so simply before. The firelight softened her features, revealing the exhaustion she had tried to hide, and she told him she had always been judged for her unusual height, often treated as a symbol rather than a person, which made his help all the more confusing. To her, he listened without interrupting, sensing how difficult it was for her to reveal anything personal, and when he assured her she was safe for the night, she lowered her guard for the first time, her shoulders finally relaxing. As the fire crackled and the wind brushed against the cabin walls, she drifted into sleep while he kept watch beside her, determined to protect the girl whose truth had already tied their paths more tightly than either of them expected. The first light of dawn crept through the cracked cabin window as the cowboy sat slumped against the wall, having fought sleep for hours while keeping the fire alive. Yet exhaustion finally pulled him under for only a few moments before the earth itself seemed to shake beneath him. A deep rumble rolled across the valley, followed by sharp cries that sliced through the morning air, and he jolted awake with his hand, instinctively reaching for his hat as the girl stirred beside the dying fire, her eyes snapping open in alarm. The ground trembled again, louder this time, and he rushed to the window, pushing aside the faded cloth, just enough to see a wave of riders pouring out of the trees, their horses kicking up dust as dozens of Apache warriors formed a tightening circle around the cabin with spears raised and voices echoing across the ridge. The girl tried to sit up despite the pain in her leg, whispering her father's name with a stunned expression, and he understood instantly that this was not a simple search party but the full force of a tribe expecting the worst. Warriors, dismounted in perfect formation, their feet stamping the ground in a steady rhythm that made the cabin walls vibrate. And then the line in front parted as a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped forward, his presence commanding the entire clearing. The chief's eyes burned with fury when he saw the rancher's silhouette through the doorway, and the air tightened like a pulled bowstring as he shouted a command that made every weapon rise in unison. The girl pushed herself upright, leaning heavily on the cabin wall as she called out to him, but her voice trembled, carrying both urgency and fear as she tried to make her father understand she had not been harmed. The cowboy knew stepping outside uninvited could spark disaster, yet staying inside would only appear defiant. So he slowly opened the door with his hands raised to show he carried no threat, his gaze steady even as a ring of warriors pointed, their spears, toward him. The morning sun caught the chief's expression, revealing shock beneath the anger when he noticed his daughter's wound wrapped with the rancher's scarf, and his jaw tightened as he struggled to understand how the man before him had touched the chief's own blood. The girl limped forward and stood in the doorway, ignoring the pain as she declared he had saved her life, her voice rising with more strength than he expected after such a harsh night. The chief's stare shifted between them, and the silence that followed pressed heavily on everyone present, for the tribe could not ignore her words. Yet the sight of her beside a rancher deepened the tension, until even the horses snorted in unease. The cowboy remained still, fighting the instinct to defend himself, aware that one wrong move could turn the clearing into chaos. And as the wind swept across the grass, carrying the last traces of dawn's calm, he waited for the chief's final judgment, knowing it would decide both their fates in a single breath. The clearing held its breath as the chief's fierce gaze shifted from the girl's wounded leg to the cowboy standing motionless in the doorway, and after a long moment of heavy silence, he stepped closer with a measured pace that made every warrior tense, as if preparing for a command that could break the fragile peace in an instant. The girl lifted her chin and repeated her story with unwavering clarity, telling her father how the trap had crushed her leg, how darkness had gathered around her, and how the rancher had freed her, carried her to shelter, and kept her alive. When the night pressed in with predators waiting for weakness, the chief listened without interrupting, though anger still flickered in his eyes like embers refusing to die. And when she finished speaking, he turned his full attention to the cowboy, studying him with a cold, searching stare that pierced deeper than any weapon. The cowboy met his gaze without retreating, aware that honesty was the only shield he had in this moment, and the chief circled him slowly, taking in the dried dirt on his clothes, the torn scarf missing from his neck, and the exhaustion carved into his features from the long night of guarding someone he barely knew. The tension grew heavy enough to choke the morning air, and when the chief finally stopped in front of him, the cowboy braced himself for judgment, expecting to face blame, punishment, or the cold steel of tribal law for standing beside the girl. Instead, the chief spoke with a voice that carried through the valley like a drumbeat, declaring that in their tradition, a man who saves the blood of the chief does not walk away as a stranger, for such an act binds lives with honor and responsibility. that cannot be ignored or dismissed. The cowboy felt confusion surge through him as the warriors lowered their weapons slightly, and the chief continued, stating with absolute certainty that the man who saved his daughter must join the tribe through marriage. For that was the ancient vow that protected lineage, unity, and gratitude. The words struck the cowboy like a sudden storm, leaving him frozen as the meaning settled over him with shocking weight. And even the girl inhaled sharply, startled because she had not expected her father to invoke such a powerful tradition. The chief stood tall, waiting for a response. But the cowboy's voice failed him as disbelief tangled with fear and responsibility he had never imagined carrying. His mind spinning with the reality that one night of compassion had placed him in the center of a decision that could reshape every part of his life. The warriors watched in complete silence. The girl stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes, and the chief remained unyielding as the cowboy struggled to breathe under the crushing truth that he had not been offered a choice, but handed a destiny he had never asked for and could not easily escape. The cowboy stood frozen beneath the chief's command, his breath unsteady as the weight of an unexpected future pressed against his chest, and before he could gather a single word, the girl stepped forward on her injured leg, placing herself between him and the circle of warriors with a courage that softened the sharp edges of the morning air. She looked up at her father, then slowly turned toward the cowboy, her gaze steady yet filled with a fragile uncertainty that made him tense, unsure of what she would say in front of the entire tribe. Her voice trembled at first, but aforesaid, the words sounded with quiet strength, admitting that she felt safe in his presence in a way she had never felt with anyone outside her people. And though the confession surprised the tribe, no one dared interrupt her. She explained that she did not want him bound by a command, nor did she want his life reshaped by fear or pressure, and she asked him to choose with an honest heart rather than accept a life forced upon him by tradition. The warriors exchanged glances, shaken by her bravery, while the chief watched her with a mixture of pride and confusion as she continued, telling the cowboy that his kindness had reached her when she needed it most, and that the calm she felt while he carried her through the forest had stayed with her long after the danger had faded. Her words struck him deeper than he expected, stirring emotions he had kept buried beneath years of solitude, and he felt the quiet bond formed in the cabin tighten around him like a thread woven from shared fear, exhaustion, and trust. Yet the memory of his ranch pulled at him with equal force, reminding him of the land he had built with his own hands, the silence he had learned to live with, and the freedom he would lose if he stepped into a life he did not fully understand. The conflict twisted inside him, a painful tangle of duty and longing, and he realized he stood on a boundary that could not be crossed lightly, for whichever path he chose would shape not only his destiny, but hers as well. She watched his struggle with gentle patience, refusing to push him even as uncertainty dimmed her eyes, and her restraint only made his turmoil heavier because he sensed she would accept heartbreak quietly if it meant freeing him from an unwanted bond. The chief remained silent, waiting with the stern stillness of a leader honoring his daughter's request, and the tribe held its breath as the cowboy wrestled with a choice that split his world in two. The wind shifted through the clearing, carrying the faint scent of pine and dust, and he felt the truth closing in from both directions, urging him to speak as he weighed the life he knew against the connection that had formed in the span of one extraordinary, dangerous night. The moment stretched until the chief ordered a fire built at the center of the camp, declaring that the cowboy's answer would be given before the flames so every soul could witness the path fate had carved. And as the light rose in restless waves, he stepped forward with a resolve that surprised even him, feeling the heat brush against his skin while the girl watched with quiet hope flickering behind the worry she tried to hide. He lifted his gaze to the chief, then to the circle of warriors, and finally to her, realizing that every fear he carried had already begun to lose its hold the moment he understood she had never asked him to surrender his life, only to see her as more than a stranger caught in a storm of danger. His voice was steady when he spoke, saying that the bond formed between them was not born from duty, but from something real that neither of them had planned, and he chose to honor it, instead of walking away to the emptiness that had once felt safe, but now seemed hollow against what she had awakened in him. The tribe murmured, startled by the strength in his tone, yet the chief nodded with the calm acceptance of a man who recognized truth when it stood before him, and the girl's breath hitched as she stepped closer, her eyes shining with a fragile mix of relief and disbelief. The fire cracked sharply, throwing sparks into the night as if the land itself approved. And the cowboy continued, promising that he did not intend to abandon his ranch or his past, but he believed their worlds could meet without fear if both sides chose respect instead of distance. His words carried a courage he had never needed until now, and the chief declared the unity born from choice was stronger than tradition, granting his blessing with a solemn pride that shifted the mood of the camp into something warmer, something hopeful. The girl moved beside the cowboy, not touching him, yet their closeness spoke louder than any gesture, and the tribe began to accept what was unfolding, understanding that this decision was not a takeover or a surrender, but the beginning of a bond that could bridge the long-standing divide between their people and his. As the fire roared higher, the night seemed to open around them, filled with a calm that settled on every face, and the cowboy felt an unexpected peace settle inside him, knowing he had chosen a path shaped not by pressure, but by clarity. "Te," Gur whispered her gratitude, soft enough for only him to hear, and he answered with a quiet promise that whatever tests awaited them, they would face them with honesty and strength instead of fear. The ceremony closed with a sense of honor rising through the camp, and as the flames dimmed, the girl and the cowboy stood side by side, bound not by command but by choice, believing that destiny had brought them together for a reason neither of them fully understood yet, but were ready to follow wherever it led. As the night wind softened and the last ember of the campfire dimmed, he felt the weight of every step that had led him here, and with a steady breath, he looked at her and knew he no longer needed to search for a place where he belonged, because fate had already carved it into his path. So he stepped closer, took her hand with quiet courage, and promised to honor the bond that had grown between them when neither expected it. And as her eyes warmed with a hope she had hidden for years, the tribe watched in calm acceptance, sensing a bridge forming between two distant worlds. And when dawn finally touched the valley with its pale gold light, he realized that his life had not been taken from him, but rebuilt with meaning. And she understood that her heart was no longer something she needed to guard, for they had chosen each other freely, creating a future neither could have imagined, yet both were ready to protect forever.